The sun was beating down on the bustling military base, but inside the sedan, the atmosphere was thick with a very specific kind of tension that usually accompanied a driving lesson under the supervision of Sergeant Carter. Private Gomer Pyle was behind the wheel, his face etched with a mixture of intense concentration and sheer innocence, while the sergeant sat beside him, his patience already wearing dangerously thin. Gomer looked out at the parking space, shaking his head with a look of genuine concern as he sized up the narrow gap between the two vehicles. He turned his head slightly toward his superior officer and said that he did not think he could make it because it was kinda short. Sergeant Carter scoffed loudly, the sheer disbelief ringing in his voice as he looked at the private and asked if that was so, telling Pyle to watch this because he would show him how it was done. Carter waved his hand dismissively, shifting his weight as he prepared to take over or at least dictate the perfect maneuver, declaring that this was the way an expert does it. He leaned over, watching the steering wheel intently as he explained that first you cut it hard, see, and then at exactly the right moment, you cut it hard the other way. The theory was perfect, but the execution faced an immediate and noisy reality check. A sudden, metallic crunch echoed through the quiet street, causing Gomer to wince and Carter to stiffen in his seat. The sergeant let out a startled sound, realizing something had gone wrong, and muttered that there they were, Pyle. Gomer blinked, looking out the window at the front bumper of their car, and pointed out that the sergeant had hit the car ahead of them. Carter gasped, his voice cracking with defensive anger as he asked what he had done. Guile repeated firmly that he had hit the car ahead of them because he heard it, adding that the sergeant's bumper must have got caught on there. Carter shook his head aggressively, looking around the empty space, and claiming that he did not hear anything. Gomer, ever honest and observant, countered that the sergeant was turned around looking in the back, so he could not have heard it. Carter snapped back, raising his voice to declare that Pyle must be out of his head because he never even touched him. Gomer looked toward the other vehicle with a deep sense of responsibility and asked if there was any damage. Carter glanced briefly through the window, waving his hand as if brushing away a fly, and insisted there was nothing, repeating that he told him he never touched him before commanding Pyle to come on and go. Gomer stayed right where he was, his conscience anchoring him to the spot, and told the sergeant to wait a minute. Carter groaned, demanding to know what the matter was now. Gomer pointed toward the shiny metal and stated that there was a scratch here. Carter rolled his eyes, asking where it was, because he did not see anything. Gomer leaned over the hood, gesturing toward a specific spot, and explained that it was right here, adding that if you lean over this way, you can see it from this angle. Carter finally caught sight of the faint line on the paint and let out a small sound of acknowledgement, but he still did not see the big deal. Gomer looked at him with wide, trusting eyes and asked if the sergeant was not just gonna leave. Carter frowned, asking why not. Gomer explained patiently that the sergeant had damaged this fellow's car, and even though it was an accident, it was still his fault. Carter sighed heavily, throwing his hands up and asking what Gomer expected him to do about it, noting that if the guy was here, he would tell him he was sorry, but it was after 6 o'clock, and he had a date with Bunny for dinner. Gomer shook his head disapprovingly, warning that if you leave the scene of an accident, that is hit and run. The phrase struck a nerve, and Carter yelled back, asking if he said hit and run over a little scratch. He argued that you could just take a cloth and some polish and just rub it out. Gomer shook his head, explaining that to really fix this up, you've got to sand the paint off and then cover it with primer and then blend some new paint in, estimating it to be at least a $10 job. Carter gasped at the amount, repeating $10 with pure disdain. Gomer smiled encouragingly, reminding him that he had insurance, so that ought to cover it. Carter snapped that he was not going to put in a claim for something like that because they would raise his rates, finally declaring that he had to go and was leaving. Gomer stood quietly by the car, saying all right. Carter took a few steps, then paused and turned around, asking what Pyle was doing just standing there. Gomer replied that he was doing nothing, just standing here. Carter frowned, noting that he thought Gomer was going to a movie. Gomer agreed that he was, but he thought he would wait on the fellow that owns this car to come back. Carter stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he asked if Gomer meant he was going to wait for him and tell him that Carter put that scratch on his fender. Gomer smiled warmly, telling the sergeant not to worry because he would take all the blame since he was the one directing him, though he added it was only fair to tell the man that the sergeant was the one behind the wheel. Gomer concluded that it was the only honorable thing to do, asking if the sergeant agreed, noting that if more people had owned up to their mistakes, there would not be any trouble. Carter cut him off, raising his hands in defeat and saying okay twice, grumbling that he would write the guy a note. Gomer beamed with joy, telling the sergeant that he was good and that he just knew he was going to feel better about this. He shared that it was just like Grandma Pyle used to always say, quoting that if my conscience ain't right, I'm going to pass the night, but if my conscience is clean, I sleep till 8:15. Carter scribbled fiercely on a piece of paper, muttering that he put out his name and his phone number, and he told him he would pay for the damage, handing it over and telling Gomer to put this on the guy's window. Gomer took it happily, promising he sure would, and repeating his grandmother's rhyme about the clean conscience and sleeping until 8:15. Later that evening, the phone rang in Sergeant Carter's quarters. He picked it up, announcing himself as Sergeant Carter here. He listened for a moment, asking who it was, and heard the name Whipple. Carter's tone shifted to a cooperative one as he realized it was the car owner, saying, "Oh yeah," his note, and confirming that it was indeed him. He smiled, listening to the praise on the other end, and replied thank you very much, acknowledging that most guys would just leave, but he just was not built that way. He puffed out his chest, agreeing that there were still some of us good guys left in the world. Wanting to get the business over with, Carter asked what it was going to cost him. The man on the other end mentioned estimates, which confused Carter. He asked what Mr. Whipple needed estimates for, since it was just a small scratch. Then the number hit him like a physical blow. Carter gasped, repeating the word "what" twice, before shouting $235. He asked for what it could possibly be, insisting it was just a scratch. He listened to the explanation of extensive damage and grew furious, telling the mister that he did not know what his racket was, but he had the wrong guy, loudly declaring that he was not about to pay him 235 clams, telling him to do anything he liked before slamming the receiver down. The next morning, Gomer found himself on the receiving end of Carter's immense frustration. Gomer looked completely bewildered, stating that he found that hard to believe. Carter sneered, telling him of course he did, because as far as Gomer was concerned, the whole world was one big Mother Goose story. Gomer looked down, genuinely apologetic, and said he sure was sorry. Carter mocked him, saying oh sure he was sorry, adding that Gomer was always sorry but that did not keep him from being stupid. Gomer asked quietly if the sergeant was going to have to pay him. Carter barked back that he was not stupid, but some other dummy probably would have paid him, and it all would have been made possible by Gomer, calling him Mr. Nice Guy with deep sarcasm. Just then, a man walked up to the area, looking around with a stern expression. He approached Carter and asked if he was looking for Sergeant Carter, requesting to know where he might find him. Carter stepped forward, stating that he was Carter and asking what he could do for him. The man, Harry Whipple, nodded coldly, confirming that he was Harry Whipple. Carter crossed his arms, saying, "So you're Whipple, huh?" Mr. Whipple wasted no time, asking one question, which was whether Carter was going to pay him or not. Carter laughed bitterly, telling him he had to be kidding and remarking that Whipple had a lot of guts coming out there like this after what he said on the phone. Mr. Whipple warned him that if he refused to pay, he could take steps, explaining he wanted to give him one chance to change his mind before he went back. Carter stood his ground, shouting that he was not changing his mind and telling him to get that straight, accusing Whipple of having a nice little racket going but asserting it would not work with him. Mr. Whipple tried to remain calm, stating he was sure Carter did not want any trouble and that he did not like making trouble for a serviceman, but warning that he would not hesitate to go further. Carter stepped closer, asking if Whipple was trying to scare him, telling him to forget it because he put one little scratch on his car about that big, and Whipple knew it. Mr. Whipple simply challenged him, asking if he would like to step outside and take a look at his car. Carter agreed instantly, saying he would like to see it and telling Whipple to show him his $235 fender. He then turned and called out to Pyle, ordering him to come along because he wanted to show him something. They walked out to the parking area where Mr. Whipple's car was stationed. Mr. Whipple pointed toward the vehicle, announcing that there it was. Carter looked down at the fender, which was completely crushed, caved in, and severely mangled. Carter's eyes went wide, and he asked if Whipple called that a scratch, demanding to know who did that. Mr. Whipple stated firmly that Carter did it. Carter denied it instantly, shouting that he did not. Mr. Whipple then asked who did if it was not him. Carter threw his hands up, saying he did not know, but he was telling him it was not him. Mr. Whipple quickly begged him to keep his voice down because his wife was in there. Right then, the car door opened, and a woman named Iris stepped out, looking incredibly annoyed. She called out to Harry, asking how long they were going to fool around here. Mr. Whipple sighed, answering as long as it takes. Iris complained that she had to get to the beauty parlor. Mr. Whipple muttered a dry comment under his breath about her appearance, then pleaded with Iris to do him a favor by staying out of this and keeping her mouth shut. Iris sniffed, saying gladly as she leaned back. Gomer walked around the front of the vehicle, staring at the wreckage in complete shock. He exclaimed that that was the worst-looking fender he ever did see. Carter agreed loudly, repeating that he did not do it, and ordered Pyle to tell the man what happened yesterday. Gomer asked if he meant from the very beginning. Carter snapped that that was right, telling him to tell him the whole thing. Gomer nodded, starting to explain that he was going into town to see a movie that was supposed to be a real good one about a doctor experimenting with dead people. Carter cut him off in exasperation, telling Pyle not to tell all of that, but just to tell him about the accident. Gomer apologized and continued, stating that Sergeant Carter was parking the car when Mr. Whipple interrupted, asking if his car hit the fender right. Gomer answered yes, sir, it did. Mr. Whipple looked at Carter triumphantly, stating that that proved it since the private was a witness. Carter protested, telling Pyle to tell him what happened exactly. Gomer explained that he was trying to do so, but Mr. Whipple just did not let him finish, clarifying that while Sergeant Carter hit the fender, he never did all of that damage, as he just made a little bitty scratch. Carter grinned, telling Whipple that there he was, and that proved it. Mr. Whipple scoffed, asking if Carter thought he was going to believe that phony story. Carter got defensive, asking what he was saying, and if he was implying Pyle was lying. Mr. Whipple stated bluntly that that was right, he was lying. Gomer gasped, repeating the word shame 3 times, and asserting that he was not lying. Mr. Whipple shook his head, stating that he only knew 2 things, which were that he got a note from Carter and he had a badly smashed car. He asked for the last time if Carter was going to pay for it or not. Carter matched his tone, telling him for the last time no, and advising him to get in his car and get out of here before he called the military police. Mr. Whipple nodded grimly, saying all right twice, and warned Carter that he would hear from him because he was in plenty of trouble. A short while later, back at the headquarters, the colonel was sitting at his desk when a knock sounded at the door. He called out for them to come in. Sergeant Carter walked in briskly, saluting and reporting as ordered. He remained at attention, then noted that he hoped the colonel did not mind, but he brought Private Pyle along just in case they needed him for some collaboration. The colonel acknowledged them, noting that this was Sergeant Carter and Private Pyle, and turned to the other side of the room where Mr. Whipple was sitting, accompanied by 2 sharply dressed men. The colonel introduced them, stating that these other gentlemen were Mr. Goodbody, his attorney, and Mr. Marshall, his insurance agent. They exchanged brief pleasantries, and the colonel stated that he was sure everyone knew what this was about, namely the accident with Mr. Whipple's car. The colonel noted that he had seen the car and the note that Carter left, but what he did not understand was why Carter refused to pay for the smashed fender. Carter explained that it was very simple, because he did not do it. Mr. Goodbody, the attorney, stood up and adjusted his jacket, asking the colonel if he minded if he asked Private Pyle a few questions, suggesting that the private could clear this all up for them. The colonel noted that this was not a court of law, but Carter spoke up, saying it was perfectly all right with him and with his witness. Mr. Goodbody smiled smoothly, mentioning that the private had been a bit reluctant to speak in front of his sergeant earlier, but perhaps here in the office they might be able to get the truth. Mr. Whipple tried to speak, but Mr. Goodbody gently cut him off, asking Harry to let him handle this now. The attorney turned to Gomer and asked if it was correct that he witnessed the accident. Gomer nodded eagerly, saying yes, sir, and started to explain about going into town to see a movie when Carter offered to take him. Mr. Goodbody guided him back, asking him to just tell them about the accident. Gomer continued, stating that they were parking and he was directing the sergeant into an awful short space. The attorney repeated the phrase, asking what else happened in that awful short space. Gomer said there was not much to tell because they were parking and their car hit the other car. Carter tried to intervene, but the colonel ordered him to please allow Private Pyle to answer the questions. Mr. Goodbody continued his questioning, asking if Private Pyle was saying that Sergeant Carter's car definitely hit Mr. Whipple's car. Gomer confirmed that there was no doubt about it because he even heard it. The attorney seized on this, asking if he heard it. Gomer added that he not only heard it, but he felt it too. Mr. Goodbody asked how he felt it. Gomer explained that with a nice new car like that, it kind of gave him a sickening feeling right in his stomach, the kind of feeling you get when your car hits something. Mr. Goodbody smiled grandly, thanking the colonel and declaring that he rested his case. Carter panicked, telling the colonel that it was just a scratch. The colonel sighed, telling the sergeant that he was in a very difficult position because it was Carter's word against the word of a good civilian, but based on all the evidence heard, there was only one thing for the sergeant to do, and that was to pay up. The colonel dismissed them, leaving Carter defeated. Gomer felt terrible about the outcome and decided to do some investigating on his own. He walked down the residential street where the Whipples lived and spotted Iris Whipple walking toward her car. Gomer approached cautiously, introducing himself as Gomer Pyle and mentioning that he saw her out at the base yesterday. Iris looked at him suspiciously, asking what he wanted. Gomer asked if her husband was at home. Iris replied coldly that he was at work and told him goodbye. Gomer persisted, explaining that the reason he wanted to see him was to talk about the accident. Iris snapped that she wouldn't know anything about that and told him he would have to talk to Harry, adding that she was getting dressed to go out shopping and was in a hurry. Gomer asked if she could tell him what happened or where he could get in touch with her husband. Iris repeatedly told him she did not have time to talk and commanded him to goodbye. As Gomer kept trying to ask questions, Iris grew angry, telling him to stop bothering her or she would call the police. Suddenly, Iris got into her car, started the engine, and threw it into reverse. In her haste and agitation, she backed up blindly, slamming the rear of the vehicle right into a large tree on the property line with a loud, crunching thud. Gomer gasped, running over as Iris stepped out of the car, looking shaken. Gomer asked where she came from, and she muttered about just coming down the street. Gomer looked at the fresh dent and asked if he could talk to her for a minute. Iris yelled at him to get away from the car, but Gomer gently asked if she always drove like that. Iris asked what he meant. Gomer pointed out that seeing her hit that tree just gave him a thought, and he asked directly if she was driving this car the day before yesterday. Iris panicked, telling him to get off the property, or she would call the police. Gomer stood his ground, saying all right, but added softly that she did it, meaning she was the one who smashed the fender. Iris broke down, tears filling her eyes as she confessed that when it happened, she panicked. She just panicked. Gomer looked at the brand new vehicle, noting that the price sticker was still on the back window, but he added that he still did not think that was any reason she could not tell her husband. Iris cried that he would never hear her out because he would take one look at that fender and start screaming at us. Gomer asked if this was the first accident she had ever had. Iris revealed that she had only been driving for 2 days, explaining that for 10 years they argued about her getting a license and she finally won, but the first thing she did was prove he was right. She lamented that their life was one long argument, and the only reason she was crying was because this was the first time Harry had been 100% right, and he was never going to let her forget it. Gomer felt a deep wave of empathy, telling her he sure was sorry. Iris sighed, asking why he had to interfere in her life. Gomer explained that he did not mean to interfere, but his sergeant was innocent and was being made to take the blame for something he did not do. Iris admitted she felt awful about it, noting that she tried to stop Harry from going to the camp, but he just started screaming again. Gomer nodded, remarking that he had met her husband, and he was a hollerer all right. Iris agreed that when he hollers, she can't stand it. Gomer asked what she usually does when he hollers. Iris replied that she hollers right back. Gomer smiled, sharing a bit of wisdom, stating that just because a person is a hollerer does not mean that he is not nice. He used his sergeant as an example, noting that Carter is a hollerer, but down deep he is one of the nicest people he ever met. Iris softened, admitting that Harry was the same way, as it was pretty deep, but basically he was nice. Gomer encouraged her, saying that was why he thought she could stand up to Mr. Whipple and tell him the truth. Iris shook her head fearfully, saying she could not. Gomer offered to help her if she would let him. Just then, a loud, angry voice boomed from the front yard. Harry Whipple was walking up the path, yelling about who left this stupid lawnmower right in the front walk, complaining that somebody could fall down and break their neck. Iris gasped, realizing he was home, and urged Gomer to go out the back way so Harry would never see him. Gomer refused, stating he would stay right there with her to give her moral support so she could face up to him. Iris begged him to forget what she said, promising she would get the money and pay Sergeant Carter back herself. Gomer told her to get a hold of herself because there was no reason to get all upset. Harry walked into the house, calling out that he was home. Iris called back that she heard, then quickly corrected her tone to a pleasant hello. Harry walked into the room and stopped, looking at Gomer with confusion and anger, asking what he was doing here. Iris quickly tried to introduce Gomer as being from the base. Harry asked Gomer if he brought him a check. Gomer explained that he just came to straighten out what really happened to the car, stating that the truth was Sergeant Carter never did that damage, and he wanted Harry to know who did. Harry grew confused, asking what this was. Iris nervously asked Harry if he would like a martini, which Harry accepted, though he was suspicious. Harry turned back to Gomer, asking who wrecked the car if Carter didn't. Iris handed her husband a massive glass, telling him to drink this. Harry looked at the size of the drink, noting that he couldn't drink all that or he would get stoned. Iris insisted he take it because she thought he better. Harry took a sip and demanded that Pyle spill whatever he had to say. Gomer looked at Iris and said he did not think he was the one who should tell him, but rather the person who actually did it. Iris took a deep breath, stepped forward, and announced that she did it. Harry laughed it off, telling Pyle to cut the double talk because he knew Carter did it since he left the note. Iris raised her voice, confessing firmly that it was her fault because she smashed the fender and let Sergeant Carter take the blame, asking if he wanted some more martini. Harry stared at his wife in absolute shock, repeating that she did it. Iris nodded, saying she was as sorry as she could be. Harry exploded into his usual shouting, asking how she could do such a stupid thing, noting that he threatened Carter, went to the base, talked to the colonel, and got everybody upset while she just stood there calmly. He asked why she would be afraid to tell him, demanding to know if he was an ogre, a monster, or a raving beast. He shouted that he was a reasonable person and she could tell him anything without beating around the bush. Iris nodded meekly, saying he was right. Harry continued, stating that they had been married for almost 20 years and a human being is allowed to make a mistake because everybody makes mistakes, even him. Iris agreed again. Harry calmed down, throwing his arm around her and stating that their problem was that they did not communicate, but once they talk it out, everything is okay. The next day, Mr. Whipple and his wife went back to the colonel's office to set things right. Mr. Whipple smiled warmly, thanking the colonel and stating it was very decent of Gomer to come to his house and straighten this out. He promised he would take care of all the damages to the car himself. The colonel thanked him. Gomer, speaking up, noted that it actually was not completely fair because Sergeant Carter did do some of the damage, figuring it was about $10 worth. Mr. Whipple said that was not necessary, but Gomer insisted, noting that Sergeant Carter would not feel right if Mr. Whipple had to pay for all of it, asking the sergeant if that was right. Carter, caught off guard, hesitated and murmured, "All right." The colonel smiled, noting it was very kind of the sergeant, and suggested he just send Mr. Whipple a check for $10. The colonel then dismissed the men to get back to their duties. As they walked out into the hallway, Gomer smiled brightly, but Carter's face turned bright red with fury. He turned on the private, calling him a knucklehead, a nitwit, and a nincompoop. Carter yelled, asking why Gomer had to open his mouth in there when he was off the hook completely, complaining that now he was stuck for $10. He shouted, asking why Gomer always had to be Mr. Nice Guy, and why he couldn't just keep his mouth shut once in his life. Carter declared that of all the stupid knuckleheads he had ever known, Gomer was absolutely the worst. Gomer smiled gently, nodding his head, and replied that the sergeant was right, totally content that his conscience was clean and the truth had prevailed.